government is corrupt. The political system is dysfunctional. Both political parties have not only failed us, they have betrayed us. We cannot trust them with our futures. We, the people, must take back control ourselves. Good evening. Welcome to the Revolution. And welcome to Revolution Television. My name is Lawrence Hebron. We'll begin tonight with our revolutionary look at the news. Headline: NBC News anchor inflates war record, deflates credibility. NBC News anchorman Brian Williams has confessed to and apologized for telling war stories that didn't really happen, at least not to him. Williams reported more than once that while covering the war in Iraq in 2003, his helicopter came under ground fire and was hit by a Russian-made RPG. Now, RPG stands for rocket-propelled grenade. An RPG is a shoulder-held rocket launcher that roughly equates to a bazooka, although we haven't used that term for a long time. Now, the story was told on the David Letterman show a couple of years ago, and again very recently. Well, somebody who was on that flight with Williams back in 2003 has shot an RPG through the anchorman's story and blown a gaping hole in his credibility. And as if that weren't bad enough, additional questions have arisen about other reports made by Williams during his tenure as a senior reporter. Williams won a Peabody Award and a Polk Award for his on-the-scene coverage of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. Among his other memories of the Katrina disaster was an account made by Williams of seeing a body float by his hotel room in the city's French Quarter. However, other eyewitnesses and a local newspaper, the New Orleans Advocate, have said that this part of the city was largely unaffected by flooding. It's a little bit higher than the rest of the city, so it's pretty hard to float a body on a moist street. Williams also claimed to get dysentery from inadvertently drinking flood water. Well, maybe, and others have reported that Williams was sick during this time. But Dr. Brobson Lutz, the former city health director, said that he did not recall a single case of dysentery being reported from the flooding. Williams has suggested that the misremembered RPG incident was perhaps due to faulty memory caused by the fog of war. Regardless, outright lie or bad memory. Is this really the kind of guy that we can trust to accurately report what's going on in the nation and around the world? The matter of commitment to accuracy and integrity has only been further complicated by NBC's slow and anemic response to the incident. It used to be that if a reporter filed a report that proved to be an outright lie, he would be fired immediately, at least by any reputable news agency. Williams temporarily removed himself from his job, but NBC took its sweet time in considering what to do, and it finally suspended him for 6 months. This dallying over the Williams incident only serves to challenge its own credibility and integrity and lowers it to the status of a sleazy tabloid. But then, some of us already knew that, didn't we? NBC, like so many other powerful news agencies, is no longer committed to accurate and fair reporting. They have become agenda mongers that advocate for a specific platform. And frankly, the truth is simply something that sometimes gets in the way and must be ignored or distorted. Whether a story is covered and how it is covered is now decided largely on the basis of how it can be cobbled into supporting their overall objective. The fine old motto of the New York Times was, "All the news that's fit to print." For today's progressive propagandist, the motto and operating principle has become, "All the news that fits." The listeners of Revolution Television have heard this before and know what I'm talking about. But we thought we would use the Williams fiasco as a launch pad to explore further the extent of the news industry's power so that we can more clearly understand the extent of the problem posed by a biased media. First, a note on context. We at Revolution Television are not interested in merely reporting things that you probably have already heard. We want to go a step farther than most news and commentary outlets and explore deeper issues. So let me set the stage for this discussion. Personal observation and statistic analysis have both confirmed the fact that we have a left-leaning bias on the part of most news agencies. Furthermore, this is no random accident. It is the result of a deliberate plan that has been underway for decades. Back in 1958, a former FBI agent named W. Cleon Skousen wrote an excellent book entitled The Naked Communist. Now, if Skousen's name sounds familiar to some of you, it's because he also wrote another excellent book, The 5,000-Year Leap, which has been popular in recent years. Now, as an aside, I've read a lot of books about communism, and I would have to say that this is the best single-volume account that I know of. Well, near the end of the book, The Naked Communist, Skousen presents a list of 45 explicit and stated goals of the Communist Party in terms of what they seek to accomplish in order to bring down the United States and convert it to a socialist nation. Now, a critical listener might interject here, so what? The Communist Party died out decades ago, and so did the Soviet Union. Very true, but their objectives did not die. They live on and are being faithfully pursued by the progressive movement in the United States, and with remarkable success. I would remind you of the observation of Norman M. Thomas, a longtime leader of the American Socialist Party, whom we quoted just a few weeks ago. He said, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened. I no longer need to run as a presidential candidate for the Socialist Party. The Democratic Party has adopted our platform." Well, getting back to Skousen and the 45 objectives for adopting every fragment of the socialist program without knowing how it happened, a great deal of emphasis has been placed by the enemies of this nation on dominating every field that shapes public opinion. That includes such things as schools, entertainment, the arts, book publishing, and the media. So just how successful have they been? Let's take a look. A recent study shows that 6 mega corporations have come to dominate the media and much of entertainment, and 5 of the 6 definitely have a progressive left-leaning bias. These 6 corporate behemoths collectively own about 1,500 newspapers, 1,100 magazines, 9,000 radio stations, 1,500 television stations, and 2,400 publishers. These 6 giants are CBS, that owns Showtime, the Smithsonian Channel, NFL.com, and CBS News. Disney, which owns Disney Studios, Pixar, Miramax, Marvel Studios, ESPN, the Disney Channel, and ABC, including the ABC News. General Electric, whose assets include Focus Features, Universal Studios, Comcast, and NBC, with the NBC News of Brian Williams fame. Fourth, Time Warner, made up of Time News, Warner Brothers Studios, Time Warner Cable, HBO, and CNN News. Fifth, Viacom, which starts shaping people's viewpoints early in life, with programming such as Nickelodeon, Nick Jr., Nick at Night, MTV, CMT, or Country Music Television, and Paramount Pictures. And News Corp rounds out the number 6 position, which owns the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Fox Network, including Fox News. Well, as you can see, so much of what you think you know about the world and life has been carefully crafted by progressive propagandists who are as committed to truth and integrity as is Brian Williams, and whose ultimate goal is to serve the interests of the power elite which seeks to transfer your wealth into their coffers and submit you to their domination. The honesty and integrity of Brian Williams is not the real issue here, however. The honesty and integrity of the media in general is the issue. So let's explore that a little further. Ian McDonald is with us again tonight, so welcome back, Ian. Well, let's start small and go big. First, should we acknowledge Brian Williams' mea culpas and let him return to his anchor chair? Or do we push hard on the handle attached to that big white porcelain bowl and flush him?
Well, my response to that would be, I think he should be fired immediately. You know, the news is our source of information, and as you pointed out, those sources of news influence everything in our lives, from political elections to the media to popularity in pop culture. The list just goes on and on and on. I think Scouten is very, very close to being correct in his, and I think that we're so far down that road right now as to being a socialist state that it's quite scary. I think Williams should be fired. He does not set an example for journalistic integrity at all.
Well, you, like a lot of others, say that he should be fired. Many people, though, tell little white lies and embellish their stories to make their tales and themselves seem more interesting. Golfers and fishers are notorious for doing this, and yet we don't usually fire them. So why is Williams different?
Well, he's sitting in the anchor desk of one of the primary broadcast news networks. I mean, you have CBS, NBC, and ABC. Now we have the cable channels, as you pointed out. This guy influences the outcome of society. He influences the outcome of elections. The news is beholden to the people. We give one industry, only one industry, special rights, and that is freedom of the press. And we do that so that we can maintain some level of integrity in government. Their first responsibility is to report impropriety in government. That's how we find out about it, is by them reporting facts, not stories, not falsehoods, not half-truths. They owe that integrity to us. We give them special rights. It's in many ways, it's similar to when a politician or a soldier or a police officer or a district attorney takes an oath of office. You know, we entrust them with certain things, certain powers over us. And in this particular case, the media is totally misusing that power.
Well, certainly, I would agree with all of that. It's supposed to be the NBC Nightly News, not the NBC Nightly Bedtime Story. Williams and others in the media shape the opinions, which in turn shape the decisions we make about the events that shape our lives. They influence how we live, how we spend our time, our money, our other resources, and especially how we vote. They have a huge effect on who is in Congress and the Oval Office, the state legislatures and governor's chairs, city councils, judges' benches, and so on and so forth. This constitutes tremendous power and correspondingly a huge responsibility. Do you think that the media in general is living up to this responsibility to provide information in an honest, accurate, and fair manner?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The primary problem that we have is the broadcast news has lost its credibility. At one point, we had the icons of the media industry, Walter Cronkite, for example, Chet Huntley, David Brinkley. You know, it goes way, way back, much further than that, but those are the ones that brought on the TV era. Walter Cronkite was, in fact, very anti-war. He did not like the Vietnam War. He is actually fairly liberal. However, he never allowed his personal bias, his personal beliefs to come out in those reports that he did on the Vietnam War. When he actually started reporting negative stories about the war. I believe it was Lyndon Johnson in around 1964-65 stated that if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the American people. He understood how valuable that was. And unfortunately, those who seek to have power over the American people also understand that, and they are trying to exploit it to every chance they get. We have very, very few unbiased sources of news. And when you see the news industry put the likes of Al Sharpton in as a news anchor, even in a commentary role, man, they're just sacrificing their credibility.
Well, that hits on an important point, too, about professionalism. There's a difference between a professional and a hack. A professional puts his responsibilities first. Regardless of how he feels about things, he puts his responsibilities first. And as you were saying, Walter Cronkite, though he had generally liberal views, a lot of people wouldn't know that. He put his responsibility to report accurately and fairly ahead of his personal desires. Now that's not the case. These corporations, these news corporations, for the most part, have become, as I've put it, agenda mongers. They're out there trying to promote a particular agenda. I also addressed the concentration of power that exists within the media a little while ago. A mere 6 mega corporations own so many of the newspapers and magazines, the radio stations, television stations, cable networks, movie studios, and certainly news outlets, all of which subtly and not so subtly mold our views and opinions. Now, there is no question that big and powerful can accomplish more than small and feeble. But what is accomplished can just as easily be bad as good. So, Ian, do you see this concentration of media power as a good thing, an opportunity for a crusader to ride in on a white horse and champion a good cause, or is this a bad thing?
Well, I think it's a bad thing because what it does is it squelches any sort of competition. In fact, right now, if you look, there is a major push within the government to regulate the internet through the FCC. Why? What do they hope to gain? We need to be asking some serious questions about their motivations. Again, I think that we've got a situation here where far too people are gaining way, way too much control over what happens in our society and the message that is produced to the public. And again, swaying that public opinion in what direction? If you look at the major news outlets, they predominantly lean very, very left. There are very few that present the conservative side of the story. And it's interesting sometimes when you enter into discussions or arguments with people about political issues. It's very obvious that the news that they're hearing is massively underreported or overreported or not covered at all. And again, that's how they sway those opinions. We've got a major problem developing in our country, and unfortunately the left is in control of the media and presenting a very negative image of half the population.
Well, you talked about being underreported, and I hope people who tune in again to our next program, because we're going to be discussing exactly that kind of an issue, something that is a huge issue, huge, and yet I've seen extremely little coverage of it in the mainstream media. Well, I'd like to wrap up getting back to our basics, getting back to the foundation of this nation and the general principles there of our founders. The founders of this nation and the writers of the Constitution were leery of the concept of the innate goodness of man. In fact, they didn't accept it at all. They therefore understood that great power would be greatly abused and with baleful consequences for mankind. Accordingly, they sought to decentralize power in order to keep the damage to a minimum. The false wisdom of the progressive movement cuts the other way. They pursue an enormous concentration of power and seek to justify it to the feeble-minded by advertising all the good that theoretically can be accomplished by a big protector. Nice theory, but in reality, it doesn't work out that way. In reality, big and bad tend to go together as much with government and media as with wolves seeking to make a meal out of little blonde girls trying to find their grandmothers. So Ian, Williams has admitted to being dishonest. Is this a fluke? Is he a rarity? Or is he a symbol of the media in general? And what can we, the people, do about it?
Well, first, I think that there are good journalists within the media. I don't think that he is exactly the norm. However, other major news faces have had similar issues. I think Dan Rather had some issues. Didn't Tom Brokaw have some issues? I don't really recall the exact specifics of that because some time has passed now. But I think that it's an indicative symptom that we're seeing, and it's progressing in the news. It's become about ratings. It's become about sensationalism. It's become about the personality, not the truth, not the facts, not the actual events that have happened. And when we look at these stories and we look at these mistruths, these half-truths, we've got to ask, what is the truth? Are we being told the truth? What is a lie? How can you trust anything that you hear when you don't know what the truth is? And when you have an industry like journalism that have lost its credibility, that has lost its way, its credibility across the board, how do you trust anything that they say?
Well, very true. You know, when you mentioned this about what is the truth, perhaps the most famous person who asked that question was Pontius Pilate. And I think it's interesting. He asked it of Jesus and says, what is truth? Notice, Pilate didn't have a clue what the truth was. He was pursuing an agenda, just like our progressives are. They don't have a clue what the truth is because their truth varies from day to day. It's whatever serves their interests. So I think it's an interesting parallel. Well, the second part of the question is, what can we, the people, do about the situation of the biased news? How can we better inform ourselves, and how can we help to put an end to these tendencies of biased news?
Stop watching them. Don't give them your business. Turn them off. Write letters to the advertisers on those networks. Tell them why that you will not buy their product. Tell them why you will no longer watch those shows. We have the same influence back at them, and it's called the power of the purse. And that's the primary thing that we have got to send to them as a message, is that we will not tolerate this lack of integrity. Either you deliver the truth, you deliver the whole story. It's like the whole truth and nothing but the truth. If you can't do that, we will not give you our business, we will not give you our money, we will not provide your advertisers with revenue.
Well, I think he hit right at the heart of the issue here. You know, it's called commercial television because it's all about commerce. Even the network, or the various cable channels, they make money from advertisers. But advertisers want to be seen. If you ever wonder why it is that programs get canceled, well, you know it's because not a lot of people are watching. Well, why is that such a big deal? Because if not a lot of people are watching, then they can't charge very much for the advertising on the program. And so they want to make sure lots of people are watching, because then they can charge more for the advertising. So you hit the nail on the head here. If we want to influence this, again, it's all about money. And if we cut off the supply of money, if we turn hard on that faucet handle so that it dry up the supply, they're going to do something different. And the internet is now a very excellent source of freedom of communication. Not always an excellent source for accurate communication, so you have to be very careful about the things that are coming across the internet. But it's a great source for communicating, and it frees us up from being reliant upon a handful plus one of dominant news companies. Well, thank you for that input. We're going to go over now to our next issue to be discussed, and Ian is going to deal with our next headline, which is Eric Holder admits failure, if you can imagine that. But wait till you hear the story and see where he thinks he's failed. Ian.
Yeah. Yes, Eric Holder, a pet subject of mine. In a recent news interview with MSNBC, Holder admitted his great failings as Attorney General. Yes, Holder admitted that he failed. However, did he admit that he failed to bring justice for the illegal actions of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives when they ran guns to drug cartels across the border? No, absolutely not. Did he admit that he failed to bring justice for the American people for the illegal use and weaponization of the IRS against the American people? No. Once again, wasn't on the list. Did he admit his failure to bring justice when the Black Panthers blocked voters at the polls in Philadelphia? No. Not one of these items were his self-proclaimed failures. In his eyes, his biggest failure was not to implement more gun control on the American people. What? Let's look at that for a moment. Eric Holder is the outgoing United States Attorney General. He is the equivalent of a federal prosecutor. He is in charge of the Justice Department. It is his job to enforce the law. He is not a legislator. He is not an elected member of Congress. Congress has the authority to enact laws. Holder's responsibility is to enforce those laws. He cannot enact laws. He has no authority to enact more gun control on the American people. None whatsoever. So yes, Holder, you failed in enacting gun control because we have a constitution that limits your ability to do so. You know, that inconvenient little document that is the foundation of what we call our law, what we call the Constitution. That document was written specifically to stop wannabe tyrants just like you, Holder. Yes, just like you. I'm calling you a tyrant. Think about that. I am putting you on the level of Stalin, Pol Pot. You might not have gone out and shot people in the head, but you are trying to do exactly what the Constitution was put in place to prevent, to stop you from enacting illegal laws on the American people. So let's expand on that a bit. I see this as the primary problem that we have in government today. A government that no longer knows its place, that no longer knows its limits, no longer feels bound by the limits of the Constitution. A militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. Nowhere else in the Constitution are those words used. None. Nowhere else in the Constitution is the word shall not be infringed used. Why were they put there with such emphasis? Why was it given such a powerful statement? It is because that is our constitutional right, our most basic right of life and liberty. Without that, we cannot protect that right. So as long as there are people in the world that will decapitate people, as long as there are people in the world that will murder people by the millions for their beliefs, their ethnicity, their gender, we have a reason to have the Second Amendment. We have a reason to protect our lives. So Lawrence, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I find it very interesting and very revealing and very disappointing and infuriating to see what Eric Holder considers to be his successes and what he considers to be his failures. He didn't consider, as you pointed out, Fast and Furious to be a failure. He didn't consider all the shenanigans with the FBI to be a failure. He didn't consider accusing an innocent police officer at Ferguson to be a failure. He didn't consider letting the Black Panthers have a pass after intimidating voters to be a failure. He didn't stand up against the imperial executive orders of his boss. He didn't consider that weakness, that cowardice, that to be a failure. He considered his biggest failure to be the inability to restrict our Second Amendment rights. And I think that says a great deal not only about Holder, it says a great deal about the man who appointed him to the office, it says a great deal about those who supported him in his nomination and got him in there. And another thing you pointed out, the strength of the words here in the Second Amendment, and kind of from a linguistic point of view, there's a big difference between the words shall and may. Shall means pretty much you will, you must. You must not infringe these things. May is much weaker, and it suggests permission. You have permission to do this. The writers of the Constitution, the writers of the Second Amendment, wanted everybody to know this is an inalienable right. The government must not be allowed to infringe upon it. Infringe means to limit in any way. And it's pretty simple. Keep and bear arms. Doggone it, 4 words. What part don't they get? 4 words. Keep means to have with you in your property. Bear means to take with you when you go beyond your property. Arms, of course, is referring to weapons. Keep and bear arms. Just that simple, and shall not be infringed. There's no limitation here. There's no qualification here. It is as clear as a bell. And yet people like Holder don't like the way that bell sounds. And so he considers his greatest failure his inability to further limit one of the most important rights of the people.
Exactly. How do you justify enacting illegal laws on the people? It has been happening for decades throughout our legal system. You know, when you look at the Constitution, it was 13 simple pages when it was written. Only 10 amendments were required by the states before it could be ratified. Think about that. Obamacare was over 3,000 pages long, and a large percentage of those pages had nothing to do with the law itself. How is anybody to be able to understand those laws when they are so voluminous? We have a situation right now where our laws are being enacted against the people that have no basis in constitutional theory. How have we reached that point? Have the leaders of our country become so corrupt that it's the only thing that matters to them is power? How about what our country stands for? How about what the Constitution says that we are supposed to be as a people? Those things don't seem to matter to them anymore. And frankly, I think we're quickly reaching a point where we're going to have to make some decisions on how we reel them back in and what will be necessary for us to accomplish that.
Absolutely, and I think you again hit it right on the head. What we need to do to reel them back in, and sitting on our haunches, sitting on our hands is not going to do it, and certainly more of the same is not going to do it either. But before we leave this issue of Second Amendment here, I know you have an interesting perspective on concealed carry permits. How do you see a concealed carry permit, Ian?
Well, first of all, a concealed carry permit is something that belongs to every citizen of this country. We have the right to keep and bear arms. And as you said so eloquently, is that we have the right to keep them and to keep anything that would be consistent with service in the militia. Think about that. That means any squad-level weapon. That does not say we do not have the right to have an AR-15. There's nothing in there that says that we do not have a right to carry a concealed weapon. The Constitution in the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights is my concealed carry permit. The government has no right to take that from me. Now think about our legal system for a moment. Our legal system, the precedent of our legal system is that we are innocent until we are proven guilty. That's how it's been since this country was founded. Suddenly, to exercise our right, we have to go to the government and we have to ask for permission. We have to ask for a permission slip. So, in effect, what they're saying is that we are guilty until we prove ourselves worthy. We are guilty until we prove ourselves worthy of that right. That's not right. It can't be that way. When you have to apply for permission to exercise a constitutional right, it is not a right, it is a privilege. So how can they justify that we are considered to be not worthy until we somehow prove ourselves to be worthy in the eyes of the government? So, Lawrence?
Well, this again is an extremely revealing position. You know, when you stop and really look at what's going on here, it reveals some very frightening things. Of course, the regressive progressives like to tell us they're doing us a big favor and trying to keep us safe by limiting our gun rights and confiscating our guns and encroaching upon our Second Amendment rights. But that's not the real story here. The Second Amendment was written for a very distinct purpose. And it was not primarily so people could hunt and help feed their families. That was a part of it, but it wasn't primarily for that. It wasn't primarily for sportsmen to be able to punch holes in targets. That was a part of it, but it wasn't primarily that. It wasn't even primarily so people could defend themselves in their homes and defend their property. That's a part of it, but it's not primarily that. The primary reason for the Second Amendment being in the Constitution and coming so quickly on the list of specific rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights is to allow the people to be protected against the greatest criminal in history, to be protected against the greatest mass murderer in history, and that is government. And the founders knew it could go that way. In fact, they knew it would go that way unless they gave the people themselves the means for protecting themselves. So when somebody comes along and tries to take that away from you, especially somebody in government, what do you think their ultimate objective is? As Ian said, we don't have to ask their permission to carry weapons. That is our basic right. And if somebody says no, if somebody says, give me your guns, I say, give me your bullets. We're going to move on now. Our next topic on Revolution Television is This Week in American History. We here at Revolution Television believe in American exceptionalism. And we believe that we want to encourage a reconnection with our proud heritage, a remembrance of America the Great. And so every program, we go through events that happened on the last week in American history. So we're going to go back to February the 4th and cover a few highlights, some fun, some very significant. February 4th, 1789. The Electoral College unanimously selected George Washington to be the first president of the United States under the Constitution. 4 years later, they would do it again. He is the only president to have been so honored with being unanimously selected by the Electoral College. 1826, James Fenimore Cooper's classic, The Last of the Mohegans, was published. 1861, 6 southern states formed the Confederate States of America. More would join shortly. 1932, the United States' first Winter Olympic Games opened in Lake Placid, New York. 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met in Yalta to discuss the post-World War II world. February 5th, 1783, Sweden recognized the independence of the United States. 1846, the first newspaper published on the Pacific Coast, the Oregon Spectator, began operations in Oregon City. 1901, Edwin Prescott patented a device that he called the loop-the-loop centrifugal railway. You know what we call it today? The roller coaster. 1937, when faced with a constitutional challenge to some of his New Deal legislation, President Franklin Roosevelt threatened to increase the number of Supreme Court justices, nominating judges who would be friendly to his agenda. He was accused of attempting to pack the court. The threat was never realized, but it did have the desired effect, and fearful justices whose knees began shaking beneath those black robes began to look more favorably upon his progressive legislation. See, the Constitution doesn't specify how many members of the Supreme Court there are to be. So it started off with a smaller number. February 6th, 1788, Massachusetts became the 6th state to ratify the Constitution. 1862, Union forces captured Fort Hood on the Tennessee River. It was the North's first major victory of the Civil War. 1899, the United States Senate ratified the treaty ending the Spanish-American War. 1911, Ronald Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois. He would become the 40th President of the United States. And in 1971, Apollo 14 astronaut Alan Shepard hit 3 golf balls on the moon. Apparently his fellow astronauts gave him a couple of mulligans. February the 7th, 1795, the 11th Amendment was ratified. It helped to further delineate the judicial powers of the United States. 1867, Laura Ingalls was born near Pepin, Wisconsin. So what's the big deal about that? Well, Laura Ingalls later married Almanzo Wilder and became Laura Ingalls Wilder, one of the great authors in American history. 1964, the Beatles arrived in New York for their first United States tour and for an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. 1984, the first untethered spacewalk was taken by Challenger astronauts Bruce McCandless and Robert Stewart. February the 8th, 1693, the second oldest college in the United States, the College of William and Mary, was chartered in Williamsburg, Virginia. Just 6 years later, Williamsburg would become the capital of Virginia. Up until then, it was Jamestown. 1870, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights regardless of race, was ratified. 1910, the Boy Scouts of America was founded in Washington, D.C. 1922, President William G. Harding had a radio installed in the White House. In 1978, Senate debates were broadcast on the radio for the very first time. Moving on now to February the 9th, 1773, the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, was born in Charles City County, Virginia. 1825, John Quincy Adams was elected President of the United States by the House of Representatives after the Electoral College could not come up with a majority candidate. If the Electoral College fails to come up with a person to elect to who gets a majority, then the choice falls to the House of Representatives. 1942, daylight savings time went into effect to conserve fuel during World War II. Although it was not called daylight savings time back then, it was known as wartime. 1943, American troops recaptured Guadalcanal in the Southwest Pacific. 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy charged that communists had infiltrated the State Department. Just to show you how much things have changed since then, today, the communists are afraid that a few patriots may have infiltrated the State Department. And for February the 10th, 1763, Britain, France, and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War. So what does that have to do with American history? Well, there was an American portion of that war. It was known as the French and Indian War. And it was during that war that a young colonial lieutenant colonel named George Washington won a claim and a reputation up and down the coast. 1861, Jefferson Davis got word that he had been chosen to be president of the Confederate States of America. 1942, Glenn Miller received the first gold record for selling 1.2 million copies of a song. You know what the song was? Chattanooga Choo Choo. 1967, the 25th Amendment was ratified. It dealt with the issues of presidential disability and succession. And now we're going to go back a little bit and tell a bedtime story, in case you need one for this evening and the kids. In 1902, Teddy Roosevelt, who was an avid hunter, was on a hunting trip, a bear hunting trip back in Mississippi. For days, Roosevelt didn't even see a bear. Then one of his guides spotted and wounded a small black bear. He tied the animal to a tree and presented it to TR to shoot. But Roosevelt, who considered himself a sportsman, saw nothing sporting in this situation and refused to take the shot. A cartoonist for the Washington Post named Clifford Berryman heard the story and drew a picture of the president turning away in disgust from shooting the helpless animal. The story of Teddy's bear grew in popularity. And it was about this time, right around February the 10th, in 1903 that two Russian immigrants started making and selling stuffed teddy bears in their Brooklyn store. Hence, a worldwide craze began. And with Valentine's Day approaching, still more of the inanimate little stuffed creatures are going to be finding homes and new friends around the country. And that is this date in history. Well, as we prepare to wrap up, I want to remind you that the American Eagle Alliance, where you are listening to this and perhaps watching this, is leading the charge in fighting the Second American Revolution, AR2. Among other things, we conduct Patriot Training Days that will teach you and your organization how to fight and win the Second American Revolution in less time than it took to win the first, without taking over the White House, the Congress, the Supreme Court, or any constitutional amendments. Back in 1776, we the people rocked the world. It's time to do it again. This is not a rehash of tired, old, failed ideas from the Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, left or right. This is vintage America. This is historic. This is heroic. This will change everything. If you'd like to schedule an event for your area and its Patriot organizations, please call 909-913-7878. Again, area code 909-913-7878. Or if you'd like me to come and discuss any of the ideas in Solutions, Guidebook for Rebuilding America the Great, or AR2, Handbook for the Second American Revolution, call that same number, 909-913-7878. You can get those books through bookstores, but probably the easiest way, a lot of bookstores will not be carrying them, they can order them, but the easiest way is probably go directly to Amazon, search under my name, Lawrence Paul Hebron, Hebron. You'll find them there, oftentimes at a bit of a discount. Let's see, we're going to close now with our quote for the day. We always try to get a quote that kind of ties in with the subject matter of our discussion. I think we've got a pretty good one here by a pretty famous American. Here it goes. If you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you are misinformed. Mark Twain. Well, thanks for listening to us, and please tune in again to Revolution Television here on AEA for USA. Now, let's get cracking, Patriots. We've got a country to save.